This morning I'm speaking with Alalu Adele, an award-winning associate faculty member here at Raw Roads, where he translates his international experiences into engaging approaches to learning. He is especially interested in international development, international relations, and humanitarian innovation, specifically topics relating to social development, diaspora studies, and international cooperation and diplomacy. Welcome.
Thank you.
Very good to see you.
Pleasure to see you again.
Yes. So Lalu, I was looking at your website and all the incredible work that you do around representation, community building, generative discourse, and co-learning. And I was quite taken by your 6 F's. You know, your belief in faith, family, friends, foreign affairs, football, and as we can see today, of course, fashion. So could you speak a little bit about why that's important to you?
Yes, I believe that anytime we enter a room, we are bringing all of ourselves. I think oftentimes we feel like there's only an aspect of ourselves that can show up. The 6 F's for me is an introduction to everyone that I meet to find a point of intersection with who I am, with who they are. So faith inevitably is something that informs how I see the world, how I interact with others, and it is definitely a huge contributor to even how I teach as well, because I believe it creates a forum in which I'm allowed to welcome the other perspectives of others and employ that in a way that will show a place of respect and honor for their perspectives as well. Family, of course, I think that goes without saying. Fashion, you know, this is our first intersection. This is our first point of interaction with the world.
Yeah.
And foreign affairs, because of my background in international relations and international development.
Yeah, I've actually been reading quite a little bit about the origins of Black History Month and how it was Black History Week and then it became Black History Month and about those incredible Black scholars. You know, I've been reading a biography of Langston Hughes recently. But I know we asked our students and faculty and staff about Black History Month and what it means to be Black in Canada. And I wondered if you could just reflect on that a little bit as well. I mean, we'd asked this question also about what does Black joy mean to you as well. But,
Sure.
Yeah.
I think the interesting part of this conversation is for such a long time it's been focused on history. And I think we're seeing this interesting intersection where we're talking about Black futures as well.
Right.
And to that end, I think we're at a very interesting point in our existence as human beings where we have the chance to interact with people who have lived history and get to recount their accounts from a personal experience. Yeah. And so I think Black History Month in Canada is especially interesting also because it's a celebration of diaspora. We have people from so many different pockets of the world. Black, yes, but from Khartoum, from Kigali, from Kaduna in Nigeria, from Kinshasa, and so all of those elements are also reflected in the celebration of Black history here. But I think another piece, to your point, you talked about Langston Hughes, and I think oftentimes we feel like we look at the American context. Not a lot of people realize that Sir James Douglas, who we have a school named after here, has that Black history, and that incorporates a new lens of how we look at what it looks like in Victoria. Yeah. Or even the history in Africville, when we think about Nova Scotia. It's a rich history there too. And just across the Juan de Fuca Strait, or the Strait, we have what happened in Hogan's Alley, and that rich history in Vancouver as well. So I think Black history in Canada is this unique intersection of those who have come now as immigrants, whether for school, whether as skilled workers, and of course those who were forcibly removed through slavery and arrived here in a different way, in a different manner. And that intersection allows us to celebrate that diversity of experiences. Yeah. And to that point, it's not a monolithic experience. I think when I think about what really made me reframe my understanding of Black history within Canada, was having my son. Because now, as the second generation Canadian, I think from a lens of being a Nigerian Canadian. He thinks from the lens of being a Canadian Nigerian. Yeah. And so that adds a different richness to this understanding as well.
Yeah. Interesting you mentioned Hogan's Alley because I'd known the history of Africville quite well, but living in Vancouver, I'd never known the history of Hogan's Alley, and then I started doing some research, and in fact, I walked down there one day where it was. The sort of flyovers there now, and that whole history's sort of been erased, but But if you don't resurface these histories, then you lose them.
And
right?
this is the
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
And that, going back to my first point about having people who are old enough to have lived that history and to recount it now from a first-hand personal experience, as opposed to just what we're reading in text, it adds a whole new richness. And I think, again, the intersection of what has happened with what the potential future can look like.
Yeah.
And so to answer your other question about Black joy, it's really this appreciation of an abundance or radiance that comes from those who have withstood the experience of egregious acts,
Right.
that now with some form of an effulgence are able to give the richness of who they are. Of course, we put it back to the melanin, the sun-kissed skin that they have. But there's an aspect of a beauty amid struggle, a beauty that reflects the generations from before in the context of now as well.
Yeah. I love your connection and thinking about Black history and the connection to the future as well. I think that's an important consideration. This is not just nostalgia or looking back. It's actually looking forward and connecting those two.
And I think that's crucial
Yeah.
because I think it allows us to see contributors as individuals. Again, 6 Fs. What aspect of me are you truly interested in?
Yeah.
Or are you boxing me in to only be the story that makes people feel some
Right.
form of sadness
Yeah.
or anger or other emotions? So let's evoke all of the emotions, sure, but let's also think about what progress looks like.
Yeah.
Let's see how we can collaborate to create a future.
Absolutely. Well, one more, another question, in fact, I mean, and you've touched on this, I mean, Black history includes, politics and science, art, culture, and every other aspect of a society. But it's also, of course, a history of resistance and of organizing towards justice. And I remember, I was born in Botswana, but I went to university in South Africa, and I remember being an undergraduate at the University of Natal, and Bishop Desmond Tutu came to talk to the student audience. And this would have been early 1980s. And it was a very raucous meeting because there were forces there were students there who were trying to disrupt Tutu. Tutu was had become, in the context of so many other leaders being arrested and being in jail,
Right.
Tutu had become the sort of face of opposition there. And I remember Tutu saying that within 10 years there would be a Black president in South Africa. And honestly, I thought I loved Tutu and very sympathetic, of course, but I thought he was delusional. And it was maybe 11 or 12 years later that Mandela became president. And I'll never forget that moment. And it was such a powerful, it's such a powerful memory for me about Black resistance and just how important it is just to keep going. It seemed like a very bleak moment, and Tutu had this incredible hope and this incredible vision sort of moving forward. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you see Black resistance and Black organization right now in dealing with the issues that sort of face us and challenge us right now on campuses, but in society more broadly. So what does Black resistance look like in Canada right now?
Oof, that's a big question.
Big question.
Let's frame it within education, I think, for
Yeah.
our purposes and our audience. I always like to break this down as I think about, as you'll come to learn about me, I love alliteration. So our first S would be to look at students.
Right.
I'll go through all of them and then we'll go into more context. Staff, spaces on campus, and then finally our syllabus.
Right. Yeah.
And we'll use these words loosely to speak a bit more about what's happening. So for students, what does resistance look like? It looks like finding solidarity. It looks like ensuring that I'm expressing my personal perspective and my lived experience, regardless of whatever circumstances may look to try to restrict that. I think it also means that we have people that we trust, feel comfortable with, and allow us to have that authentic expression of ourselves. So that when I show up, all of me can show up. For staff, and we'll say put faculty in that too, I think there's an aspect again about representation, but again, an aspect where you actually esteem my knowledge, you esteem my accreditation, you esteem who I am as a person, so that when I'm speaking, my voice is not silenced, but it's actually empowered and encouraged. I think that's resistance.
Yeah.
It may not seem so because we're not holding a banner or we're not marching, but I think that's the resistance, is
Yeah.
being able to actually speak about who you are and not be boxed in. For spaces, I think it's a conversation when we think about when our students are in these different parts of our campuses,
Yeah.
do they also feel able to thrive? You know, safe is a word that I think we've thrown around a lot, but I think it's about thriving.
Thriving,
Maybe it's a
yeah.
precursor
Yeah.
to thriving,
Yeah.
but do they feel that this building is as much mine as it is yours? As much this history, this rich history, Laquangan
Right.
history that of this place that we live on to,
Yeah.
on these lands of which we live on as well. So how then is that translated in when I show up in this space, I'm also able to fully be myself?
Yeah.
And then the final piece about syllabus, you know, it's interesting because I think so often, specifically in an academic institution, we talk about this being a place where we're able to challenge ideas. We're able to
Right.
employ new methodologies, new ways of thinking, learning, being, knowing.
Yeah.
But I think oftentimes there's a lot of information that exists in the canon, and so we don't challenge it. And we say that, where did you get that from? Because now it doesn't come from the same history, which has
Yeah.
been esteemed to be the correct history for such a long
Yeah.
time. So the resistance is, when I say Wole Shoinka, or I say Chimamanda Adichie,
Yeah.
or I say Chinua Achebe,
Maybe. Yeah.
now, and you know who those people are.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's richness.
Yeah.
You know, when we talk about alternate ways to think about pedagogy, so it's not just in rows, it's in circles. That's a resistance.
Yeah.
When it's employing different ways of thinking about learning that don't just involve textbooks, that's a resistance.
Yeah. I loved your description or your comment about safe and safety, because actually I've been having a challenge about talking about making the campus safe for people. I love the concept of thriving. Like, let's make this a place where you thrive,
Yes,
not
please.
simply feel safe.
Yes,
right?
please.
And I also don't think we can always guarantee people safety. You know, part of it being at a university is to be challenged, actually. You know, and you might not always feel entirely safe psychologically, but broadly, is it a place where you can thrive? So I love that concept. So thank you for that.
And I think it's even more interesting as we think about it, because ideally you come to a place of learning to expand, to increase, to grow in some shape or form. And growth is always going to require some instability. And perhaps, but I think what's more important is, on the point of safety, is that people feel that they are even empowered to engage in a space which, again, they can fully show up. And I think that's crucial.
Yeah.
So this actually is officially my first time seeing you since your reappointment.
Thank you.
And so it's been an honor to get to know you, of course, over your first term, and I'm very excited for what is going to come in the future. One of these points of that really raises an interesting reflection is when you started here in 2019, what we thought about education, what we thought about higher education, what we thought about the interaction of students looked very different.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, in 2020,
Yeah.
myself and several other colleagues got together and we formed the Anti-Racism Action Plan.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask and pose a question to you. What are the developments, have there been any further developments on that plan and those recommendations that were put forth to you?
Well, you know, first off, I want to thank you and your colleagues for that plan. I mean, it was an extraordinary plan. We know that it followed the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the social justice movements which developed across our country and in other places. So I think a very important kind of pivotal moment for universities and post-secondary institutions generally. The plan, as you know, because you were intimately involved in its development, is an incredibly ambitious and aspirational plan, and we're deeply committed to its implementation. But I think where we have made some progress, for instance, I think a very important kind of recommendation that came out was the establishment of a standalone Office of Human Rights, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion, which we have done. And we've got the fabulous Alejandro Campos Garcia in that role. And as you know, I've switched the reporting of that function, so Alejandro reports directly to me now, because I think that's an important signal to the community about the priority of that work. Alejandro's doing
Fantastic job.
Some remarkable work. I would say one of the big pieces is the development of the new strategic plan around human rights, equity, diversity, and inclusion, because we need a kind of frame around all of these issues. Um, there are a great number of recommendations, as you know, and putting them in a frame, I think, will be very helpful moving forward. I think we've got a lot of work to do. And when you spoke about, you love your alliterations, you were speaking about your S's. So there's a lot of work to do on the student front, I think. Around syllabus, curriculum in general. I think around providing those spaces, so as you say, people can feel not only safe, but they can actually thrive in those spaces. We need to figure out, and drawing on the recommendations of the plan, what we can do to make that happen. I think we've got a lot more to do on the kind of training and awareness front as well. We have done some work in that respect with various surveys we've sent out, just trying to get a sense of the diversity of our community, how people feel in this space. Our employee engagement survey, the last one as well, we tried to get at some of the issues that were raised in the anti-racism task force, just around people's sense of belonging here. Do they feel included? Do they feel involved? Do they feel engaged? So there's a lot more to do. But in my view, this is a living plan.
Yes.
It's not something which will just sit there on the shelf. We will continue to sort of work on it and work at it. And I think the issues you raised, earlier, are the very issues that go to the heart of those recommendations. And it's important. This is really, really important work.
So, President Steenkamp, some great news about the expansion of Railroads, but not only expansion, the collaboration between multiple institutions here on Vancouver Island. And so we have the new West Shore campus that's going to be opening up in 2025. Just thinking about those themes that were included in our report to you. Theme 1 really spoke about building space, place, and connection. Theme 2 spoke about supporting our students. So thinking about this expansion and this collaboration and integration really of different ways of approaching education from our respective institutions, how do we uphold those themes even as we think about this new campus?
Well, I think, a critical component of that is actually talking and listening to students, as an example, and faculty and staff, but getting their advice and their input. And we have been doing that in terms of, for instance, the design of the building. What should this look like? We've been working very closely, as an example, with the Indigenous communities on design, but also on curriculum. So we need to continue to do that. Just keep asking and keep listening about what should this space look like. My dream is that a student arrives there at the new campus and feels as though this is their home.
It's theirs.
It's theirs. The kind of rationale for building this campus was to build something on the West Shore, which was closer to home for students.
Right.
The West Shore, as we know, is one of the fastest growing areas in Canada, in fact. And we also know that the West Shore has a high percentage of new Canadians. And it also has a high percentage of families whose children would be the first in their generation to attend post-secondary. So the whole design of the building, the curriculum, the approach, has been with all of that in mind. So if you are an Indigenous student from the West Shore, if you are a new Canadian coming from wherever, when you walk in those doors, you should feel welcome, that this is your home, right? Not some foreign elite institution where you feel intimidated. Yeah.
And to your your former point about this being an iterative process, a continual dialogue, which is so key. I think about this as an opportunity as we think about, the multiple institutions here. And of course, you interact with many different presidents at different institutions. But this is a perfect opportunity as we think about what does this look like between us, but also as we work together. To that end, the Scarborough Charter came out in 2021. And, this charter has been there to talk about Black flourishing within the educational context. So what does this look like even as we think about, we already have our action plan in place. Can we expect to see this as something that Railroads, there's currently 50 signatories, is this something that Railroads has looked at and is interested in pursuing as we think about that thriving element for Blacks on campus?
Yeah, I would say we've been very interested and very engaged in the Scarborough Charter process. A good colleague of mine, Wisdom Teddy, was very instrumental.
Absolutely.
I knew him when I was at UBC. He and I sit on the board of the Conversation Canada together now, so we in sort of constant discussion. I would say we have been informed by the Scarborough Charter process, as institutions have. We've taken elements from Scarborough Charter to help inform our approaches. For me, I want to be in a position where we are ready to make the commitments that are included in signing that agreement, and I think we'll be there soon.
Okay.
So the fact that we haven't signed is not a lack of interest. In fact, it's an intense interest, but also a serious commitment that we can actually live up to the commitments we make by signing.
By being a
Scarborough.
signatory.
Yeah. But we continue to be involved. I mean, I personally continue to be involved in that process. I know folks at the university as well have been very involved in it as well, and it certainly informs a lot of what we do. So yes, the short answer is yes. We're on the pathway to signing.
And I love how you spoke about really doing the work beforehand, the precursor, if you will, to signing, which is equally as important, so that we ensure that it's something that's sustainable and it's not just something that's ratified and not lived up to. So definitely, just because of some of these elements we've spoken about today, Black joy, flourishing, and really thinking about upholding these things within an academic institution, they definitely intersect. And of course, we're already doing great work, but all the more for that partnership and collaboration between institutions. I'm going to pause here. I want to ask you about your experience. We talked about it a bit earlier in terms of that pivotal moment for you in the presence of the late great Desmond Tutu, Bishop Tutu, and your experience with apartheid as well. So could you speak a bit to your reflections on that and how that's even informed how you think about pedagogy or working in higher education yourself?
Well, what I love, of course, about Black History Month is I'm a historian by training and interest. I grew up in Southern Africa. I was born in Botswana, but I did most of my education in South Africa during apartheid. In fact, sort of what I would call the high noon of apartheid, almost. My parents had actually been to the same university I went to, which was the University of Natal in Durban, back in the 1950s, when the university was integrated at that time.
Okay.
And it was, only after the apartheid government came in and they segregated the universities. When I started my undergraduate in 1980, it was the first time since the 50s that Black students had been readmitted in very, very small numbers, though. And of course, the University of Natal had the very famous medical school, which was only for Black students. And Steve Biko, of course, was a student of that school. So it's a really interesting history. But when I think about the history we were taught at school, the African history I was taught at school was the history of Europeans in Africa. So it was mostly about European competition and conflict. So, for Southern Africa, that would have been, the Portuguese conflict with the Dutch, then the Dutch conflict with the English, then the English conflict with the Afrikaners. And Africans were incidental to those histories. They only showed up when they sort of interacted with European power. There was some fascinations, for instance, the rise of the Zulu kingdom was something,
novel.
It was novel. It was seen, here's a warrior and a warrior kingdom. So, but fetishized almost, I would say. But the actual African history of Africa was really hidden. When I got to university, it was a revelation for me, because then suddenly I was with faculty there who were talking about the African history and trying to reconstruct that history, still through various lenses. But that's what got me sort of very, very interested in history and learning about African history and pre-colonial African history in particular. And you mentioned earlier some of the authors. I mean, I remember first year university, Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart. And then getting into African literature too, which is a wonderful lens into African history too. So, for me, what the kind of revelation for me was really these hidden histories and uncovering them and reading African authors.
Right.
Because, you know, African history was often told through a different lens, a storytelling lens, right? So Black History Month, you know, is so important, as you've mentioned too, because it's uncovering hidden histories as well. And if we don't do that, then you kind of wander rudderless into the future, right?
Sure.
If you root it in your history and you kind of know where you came from and what happened, I think it just helps kind of inform, you know, how you live
And the path forward.
Yeah, and that path forward, which is so critical. Yeah.
You know, I think you speaking about it, it's a perfect way to think about it. It's been, you know, buried.
Yeah.
And so it's unearthing these
Yeah.
and actually bringing light to it. I mean, the conversation about Black history in itself it is Canadian history.
Yeah.
It is American history. It is
Exactly.
whichever
Yeah.
diaspora or country that Black people
Yeah.
exist in, they are part of that history.
Yeah.
You know, there's multiple histories, of course. And going back to the storytelling piece, and this is where I really feel the piece about meeting people who have lived that history
Right.
and intersecting with them to get their accounts
Yeah.
is equally as important as what we're reading in text. In fact,
Yeah.
in some instances, specifically when it's been told through a Eurocentric lens, or you
Yeah.
know, it's even more important to challenge those narratives as well. So
Yeah. Well, just another example. I mean, you know, Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya. You can read about it, drive actually a history through a Eurocentric lens,
course.
and then you read Ngugi wa Thiong'o's novels, you know, and then
Worlds of
suddenly
difference.
worlds of difference, right? And then that sparks all this curiosity and this kind of critical thinking. So, yeah.
that critical thinking piece is something which I love about how we approach education here at Railroads. You know, we have a learning, research, and teaching model that has kind of 3 pillars to it: the applied and authentic, the caring and community-based, and finally the transformational,
Right.
the life-changing aspect.
Yeah.
As we think about what that means in the context of really empowering and celebrating these different histories and thinking about what it means pedagogically and within classrooms, what would be your charge to faculty, students, staff, as we think about Black History Month this year?
Wow, it's a big question. You know, my charge would be immerse yourself. Like immerse yourself in all these different perspectives. I think our colleague David Black says, take a walk in the wilderness intellectually, right? Just go out there and read and find everything you can from all different perspectives, and then use your critical thinking to sort of sort that through. You know, this is not directly related to your question, but the terrible circumstances we find ourselves in right now with the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And, you know, when I look at the way in which people are weaponizing their interpretations of the different histories against each other, it's so disturbing, you know, and it's so selective and it's so partial as well.
Yes.
And, you know, what I've done since October is I've tried to immerse myself in those histories.
In both histories.
In both histories. The Jewish history, read the Jewish authors. Read about Palestinian history, read the Palestinian authors. So immerse yourself. So for Black History Month too, I would encourage all of us to kind of immerse ourselves in these histories. As you mentioned, there's very rich history across Canada and a very diverse history.
Yes.
Just get familiar with these histories and sit down and talk to people and listen to people as well. I think, you know, that's the charge. And it really does align well with our learning, teaching, and research model as you've described it. You know, that authenticity, that transformational piece. But that's how we learn. We kind of learn. We learn by doing, we learn by listening, we learn by engaging. So the charge is sort of try and break out of your own frame right now and go for that walk in what might be a wilderness to you, but it's not a wilderness to others.
Right.
And because I'm, you know, a historian and deeply interested as well in literature, I just say there's some fantastic novels out there too. Go and read some novels.
I've given 3 names already.
Yeah.
At least, you know, 3 Nigerian names, of course, there's plenty.
Yeah.
You mentioned Langston Hughes,
Yeah.
but definitely, there's a
Yeah.
wealth of literature out there,
Yeah.
definitely. And truly, I feel, to your point that you made earlier, storytelling is really the way in which it unlocks a whole new way for us to appreciate histories. Because I think when we read text, sometimes it's just seen as factual, and it doesn't have the nuance of, you know, the uniqueness of that person's lens or experience. But characters bring history to life in a whole new way, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, you know, in a world and in a time where everything seems so polarizing, stories are the things that actually help us to create that actual connection with people. So,
and you know, as we always say, you know, Black History Month, but it can be Black History Year.
It goes on. It goes on. It doesn't stop.
It doesn't stop. It's a moment for us to you know, take a moment to take stock, to reflect, to engage, to discuss. But this should continue.
It should carry on.
Yeah, I want to thank you so much for your great work here and your interest as well. And thank you for taking my questions, and thank you for asking me questions.
No.
Yeah,
My pleasure. My pleasure. Always a pleasure to connect.
Yeah, thank you.